Hey there, and welcome to Google's Innovation for the Nation 2013. I'm Christopher Dorabek, anchor and managing editor of GovLoop's Dorabek Insider, an online program and blog that, I forget what I do, that focuses on 6 words, helping government do its job better. And that's exactly what we're focused on here today, helping you do your job better. And we're doing that by introducing you to the government transformers, the people who are out there figuring out how to get the job done in these challenging times. And right now we're going to talk about mobility, and security. No challenges there, right? During this presentation and throughout the day, if you have questions or comments, we want to hear from you. 2 ways that you can do that. You can submit questions here in the virtual conference center. You visit the networking lounge within the event and just tap Ask a Question. And so you can do it that way, or tweet us. The hashtag we're using is IFTN2013. Yes, it stands for Innovation for the Nation 2013. So you can tweet that or tweet me directly at @CDorabek. We'll answer as many questions as we can during our time together. There will also be an opportunity to ask your questions, to chat with these good men afterwards. We'll tell you more about that later on. A bit of a preview of what we have coming up today. We're going to talk about needles and haystacks. Yes, we're going to talk about how you can speed access to mission-critical knowledge, which we all know is out there, but we can't always get our hands on it. We'll talk about that. We're also going to talk to the National Archives about how they're collaborating better using all these technologies. So that's coming up. And of course, if you miss any of these discussions, they will be available on demand on the Google Federal YouTube page. And we'll also, if you register, you'll get a link, and we'll tell you how you can do that. But let's talk about mobility, and security. Let me introduce. Ian Kelly is with Google, and Mark Williams is Director of Government Solutions for AirWatch. Mark, let's start with you and talk a little bit about this mobile insecurity. People hear these terms, and frankly, they start to break out into a flop sweat. This is one of the big challenges that I think they have these days, isn't it?
Absolutely, Chris, and thanks for having us on today. I guess what we call it sometimes, or you hear customers call it, is an unmanaged mobile network is death by 1,000 cuts. So you run into all of the granular functionality that you may need to manage if you're using a mobile device management solution. So you can do an end-to-end all the way from device enrollment throughout the life cycle and manage all of the functionality that's in between, and then ultimately decommission the device and presumably, depending on the sensitivity of the data, have all of that data wiped or have just the enterprise or government data wiped, depending on how your policy is set.
So Ian, talk a little bit about mobile and security and what it means in a Google framework.
Yeah, sure. So Google has a little bit of a strange take on life. We have hundreds of millions of users out there, and our enterprise division has really been working on bringing consumer technology to the enterprise. And nowhere are we seeing more of this kind of ways of securing the data and bring this information to the forefront than through devices like the Android framework. Right? It's looking at ways to take kind of concepts that people are used to in their daily life, and then being able to bring them forward, bring them to work, and make them an honest-to-God, secure solution to perform the tasks they need to perform at work. It goes a little bit further than that to me, though, because it's not just, can you play Angry Birds in the device? It's, can we drive innovation? Can we drive new technologies? Can we give census workers maps in the field that enable them to more effectively carry out their job? Can we equip law enforcement agencies with tools and devices that can actually make their agents more successful, safer in the field, all that type of behavior? And so Google's mission on this really is to bring kind of the cutting-edge technology to places like the federal government to enable their workers to be more productive and more innovative.
And Chris, let me expand on that a little bit and say, first of all, I agree with everything that Ian said there, and I'd like to ask Ian to comment too, because I think on this addition, because I think that Google has a good story here, in that the government in particular has a lot of security certifications in place. So they're fundamentally HSPD 12, the presidential directive, and then you have the National Institute of Standards, FIPS security certifications. And so I know that Google has addressed those at the device level. And then you move even further to cloud-based security certifications, and you see the government now is moving toward FedRAMP and FISMA certifications in the cloud. and even further with DoD with the Secure Technical Implementation Guide. So, Ian, can you comment on where you are with those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, geez, about 3.5 years ago, Google Apps received the first kind of cloud-based FISMA ANA to operate, right? And it was kind of, before that I was thought, could you really accredit a cloud-based solution? Well, we looked at that and said, we think we can. We think there's tremendous value. We've seen huge agencies like GSA, NOAA, Department of Interior, go Google, right? Moving their core collaboration email capabilities onto the Google infrastructure. And they're taking advantage of the cloud technologies and the behind-the-scenes technologies that Google already employs to secure the data. And what we're seeing now is kind of the next wave of this, is people understanding that Google can secure the data in the data centers and in this kind of cloud environment. Then the next question is how do we get that information to the edge? Right? And that's why it's been great to work with people like AirWatch to say, can we provide people a real mobility solution that gives them productive, real-time access to the data in a form that makes them better able to accomplish their tasks? Right? It's not worrying about just pure messaging. It's all of the amazing new things they can do.
Mark, I want to talk a little bit about, because I've seen a bunch of stories now talking about agencies thinking about a world post-Blackberry because of all the stuff Blackberry is going through. But given what Ian said, can you explain a little bit about what AirWatch does? What's your role here?
Yeah, so I'm Director of Government Solutions here at AirWatch, and we're the largest vendor in the enterprise mobility management space, which is also probably better known as mobile device management. And in that role, what we've been able, mobility is a good place to be, I should say, right now. So I started with the company 2.5 years ago. We had 120 employees, and now we have 1,500, and we continue to grow at a pace to meet customer growth. So we're at about 9,000 enterprises under contract. So in that space, what we see is all of the enterprises, government and commercial, are interested right now in how they're going to manage their mobility networks, manage and secure those. A lot of them are taking their lead from what they see the government doing. So we're closely collaborating with Google and the Android developers to meet all of those specifications that Ian just went through and that I sort of prompted for different types of FIPS, FISMA, and FedRAMP certifications.
So is this securing the data as it gets into the mobile device? Is it being able to wipe the device if and when it gets lost? Is it all of these things and more?
Yeah, so it's all of those things and many, many more. So that's a good question, or really a couple different directions we can go from there. But fundamentally, Google and the Android team have been able to work with the National Institute of Standards to build device-level security using FIPS certified encryption for data at rest and data in transit. So they have the device-level encryption covered. And then from an AirWatch perspective, you can enhance that if you want to encrypt the email container, for example, with an additional layer of AES 256 FIPS certified encryption. You can also do that for content management. You can wrap the application catalog in FIPS encryption. Then you have a multi-layered encryption approach, which I'll put that back to Ian too, is what are you seeing from a cybersecurity specialist perspective? It seems that what we're seeing is that they do like to see layered security, because if one layer is breached, then it's usually detected, and prior to any data loss, before breaching the second layer, they can resolve it.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and I think it's, so when you start looking at things like the 4.3 release of Android, we released things like the security enhanced Android, which is based off of, for the technical people out there, it's based off of the SE Linux stack. Right, so we start having things like mandatory access controls. We start having increased sandboxing between different processes to ensure that there's no kind of data leaking from one place to another. There's containerization to enable that even kind of root level programs can't go ahead and do really terribly malicious things. Right? There's all of these boundaries that we've layered in. And if you look at kind of the lifetime of an application, they're essentially going to come traditionally from a trusted source like Google Play Store. Or they may come from somebody like AirWatch pushing the application to the device. But either way, we're going to do some vetting ahead of time, and then we're going to also continue on doing real-time runtime checks. We're going to run all kinds of security checks in the background to do things like verify the applications aren't sort of known to be malicious, right? So even after we've gotten past the initial install, we can still apply some intelligent security, intelligent detection to make sure that nothing, I guess, nefarious is going on. And if you continue down this path, there's a number of different layers all the way down to process isolation, different sandboxing technologies to make sure that if an application wants to touch data, it explicitly is defined exactly what it can touch, what it can't touch, and that we have the appropriate ways of making sure that those kind of policies are enforced through a central way. All right, and this is kind of some of the interplay we get between Google and AirWatch. Is Google providing a kernel that's fundamentally secure based on the Linux kernel, and then being able to layer on technology like that provided by AirWatch to make sure that corporate policies, agency policies, organization policies are applied appropriately to make sure that the data is secured.
Right, and I'll add, in this little ecosystem that we're talking about for enhanced data like Android SE, Linux SE, we are partners in the ecosystem with some of the most trusted partners of government, so the largest systems integrators, and they're adding their own custom enhancements to that technology and then running those through the government agencies to get their feedback and ultimately for their design recommendations. So we think that we probably combined have the most secure functionality that you can get as you work with the folks that are experts in that functionality.
Ian, it sounds like I think a lot of agencies, they had the Blackberry server and they just basically had, that had the connection with their Blackberry, and it sounded so simple and what you're describing is more complex. Why are there benefits that come through this complexity, and do you get the same security that you had in the good old days?
So my opinion might be a little bit biased. I think at a very fundamental level, you're actually getting better security than we ever had with Blackberry, and that's not a knock against Blackberry. It's one man's opinion. Really, to me, though, what we had with Blackberry was it was an easy model to understand. You had a Blackberry enterprise server. You had Blackberries. You managed the server. It did what it did. It didn't do what it didn't do, and kind of the constraints were well understood around that. Right, but the notion of putting a portable globe cut from 15-meter resolution NGA data onto an actual device, that was science fiction 10 years ago. That just did not exist. And so now when we look at these, kind of the threat and vulnerability surface is fundamentally different. It's kind of classic risk-reward behavior that the more capable a device is, the more benefit it brings. We need to apply a little bit of caution to that to make sure that we have the appropriate controls in place. In Android, there's not one sort of one-for-one replacement to a Blackberry server. Instead, what we have is kind of a buffet menu of options of ways of securing data, so that not everybody's pigeonholed into the same security framework. Instead, we give them kind of a variety of options of ways to secure data. So where one agency may need to containerize data, another may say, you know what, we prefer our people to be closer to the cutting edge. Let's let them use kind of the default environment of the devices.
That's exactly right, and I would add, so post-BlackBerry, what we're basically seeing is that customers, especially in the government space, want to deploy a best-of-breed technology. So they're looking at saying, as Ian says, specifics. They're asking to have certain things customized. Many different types of certificate-based authentication aren't really truly customized from scratch necessarily, just the way that you deploy or employ those. And so we have everything from the gamut of energy infrastructure companies like the big petroleum companies that have developed their own passwordless type of authentication to very security-intensive groups within the military that are doing derived credentials and all kinds of different inventive things, all of which are customizable via the MDM, and if they're not, that's what we go back to the Android developers with and say, let's talk together with this customer and see if we can customize it.
Mark, I know one of the big aspects to this is that you need a security policy that's, if you don't have a good security policy, the rest of it all sort of falls by the wayside. What are some of the elements of a good security policy?
Well, again, so to meet all of the functionality that the customers want, you have to be able to do everything end to end and manage in a very granular way all of the functionality of the device. So it starts at the very fundamentals of what is your password policy going to look like. Then if you put the password in place, are you going to activate encryption and what types of encryption? And then what things you might want to encrypt come into play. And it can go on and on and on to where you say, okay, well, let's not just do encryption for, say, access to a sensitive document, but let's figure out who gets access to that document, when, what time parameters, possibly from a GPS location perspective, you would say, where is that individual when you want to be able to give them access to that document. So conceivably, if the device were stolen and taken to China, you would be able to notice electronically that the device is where it is and disallow it from being able to access information of that nature. So you go all the way through all of those things. Every country, every municipality has a little bit different tweak on the restrictions and the legalities that they impose on some of those things. So you have to be quite flexible to do this in a big multinational type of environment.
Ian, did you want to comment on security policy issues and how you sort of, it can become this big issue, and where do you start? But I know there are key issues.
Sure. So to me, there's three pieces to the whole equation, right? It's picking a device that you believe to be a good starting point, right? And that's not purely a security discussion, but that's also giving users something they want. We've talked to a number of customers where their user base has 2 devices at all times, and they're using a personal device to conduct official government business.
Right.
And they want to get their users out of that business by making their primary device capable enough to be used. Right? It's kind of the old adage that if security is too cumbersome, somebody will find a way around it. So to me, the starting point of this is finding a device that users actually want. The second piece gets to exactly what Mark was talking through, is how do you take the device and how do you secure it? How do you make sure that you have the appropriate kind of IT technology decisions on the device? Right? Can they play Candy Crush? Can they not? Can they use it to Skype? Can they use it to block? Can they use it to post? Can they have personal information on it? How do you actually wipe the device? All of those sorts of implementation details. And then in particular for the Android case is the question of, whose device is it really? And a number of agencies are concerned that their users are going to be signing in the very first time they pick up an Android device and saying, I'm user 1 of some agency at gmail.com. And they really don't like that idea because then it's the user who's kind of made the contractual model with Google. Instead, we're starting to find people liking an idea of governance on the back end, of actually being able to use their actual government email addresses as the fundamental login way to get into the device. Right? It sets up kind of, instead of a tripartite relationship where the user's in the middle, it sets up all of the contractual framework between the agency and Google directly, so that if they do need to get access to information, if they do need to worry about FOIA requests or whose information really is on the device, it's a very clear starting point, and it enables a lot of kind of governance-related provisioning of accounts, deprovisioning of accounts, all of the sorts of kind of second-order things that you typically worry about. Right? Once you've got, yep.
Sorry, Chris, I'll add to that too. That's right on target, and the sandboxing of different functionality and being able to secure and encrypt the data is really highly affected by what applications the customer wants to use. So as you get into Department of Defense applications or law enforcement, many of those are very security sensitive, and then you even move into the healthcare arena. And we have a lot of now the healthcare providers want to have electronic patient records appear on the device, which is a real benefit because by doing that, they've made the entire process of the healthcare provider-patient interaction much more efficient. But when they're doing that, they have to overlay all of the HIPAA certifications and security considerations on top of that as well. So you start to see how much flexibility matters as you're developing different functionality for the devices. And essentially what you're using with an Android device, we like to use the analogy of a Swiss Army knife, and it's got all kinds of different inventions on it that you can use, and in this case, all kinds that have to have some consideration for the different security functionality they might use on those.
We're running out of time, and I want to, the last question I'm going to ask you, this is a little warning for you guys to start thinking about it, but what three things would you want folks to think about in terms of mobile security? But before we get there, we were talking about the Blackberry framework and how this, it seems so simple. And I can hear people, I have this ability telepathically, I'm hearing people out there saying, hold on, why do I need something like AirWatch and Google to do security? Tell us how you guys work together and why it's important to have this partnership.
Sure. So to me, there's always the concept of defense in depth. Right? It's not enough to have just one point of security. I think people learn that the hard way. So I was working with a sales guy. He refers to it as the belt and suspenders model. Right? It's make sure that the device itself is secured, but additionally, we want to make sure that we can do some back-end security. So if we use, a domain that the government actually owns, they can control things like, is the user allowed to blog, email, make comments, upload things to Google Plus or social media, things like that. And so it takes beyond some of the capabilities that AirWatch can do to protect the actual device with on-device encryption and add some back-end security to it. Mark, I don't know if you have a different take on that, but that's my thoughts in a nutshell.
That's similar to what I would have said, but I'll also add in that what we've been able to do now with the Android device manufacturers, and again, in this little ecosystem where we have Google and their Android development team, AirWatch is sort of Switzerland in the middle, being agnostic to support all of the devices that are out there. And that puts us in a position where we're also partnered very closely with the Android device manufacturers. So what you saw a couple of years ago with the belt and suspenders analogy and the way things were, you could only secure a certain amount of things, and there were just a few. So you could manage passwords, you could wipe a device if it were lost or stolen. Now, with some of the leading device manufacturers, there are over 1,000 APIs or interfaces that are available to be managed by the MDM. So we take information from the customer, share that with the Google developers, with the device manufacturer developers, co-develop the solution, and then bring that back to the customer. And that's changed from 2 or 3 or a handful of small things to over 1,000. Now you can get super granular with it.
So folks thinking about mobile and security, of course, everyone's thinking about mobile and how they do this. Walk them through, Ian, why don't you start? Walk them through a couple things that they ought to be, almost help create a checklist for them. What should be on their checklist of things to think about?
So for me, the starting point is, are you looking at a bring your own device policy, or are you looking at actually providing devices for users? There's some pretty significant pros and cons on both sides. For a lot of people coming from a totally homogeneous environment, it's easier to give everybody one device or maybe a small handful of devices. The second piece is really how are you going to secure the data on the device? Are you going to rely on the actual the device security, something like Samsung has Knox technology that has different personas. Is that enough to satisfy your needs, or do you need additional containerization? So all of those policies. And then the third part is how are you going to do the governance over the accounts used on the phones? I probably sound a little bit like a broken record, but to me that's the most mature customers we've talked to have been starting to take that into consideration. And they're going beyond just what can the device do or not do, but they're saying, how are we going to manage these things in out years? How do we manage these 2 years, 5 years from now? How do we make sure that one account is consistent from device to device to device, year after year after year, that we're not going to be upgrading or degrading capabilities between places? Somebody leaves the organization, how do we make sure that we deprovision their account? So to me, there's a huge area that's this nascent understanding of how to actually govern the accounts used on the devices. That to me is the single big one that I think it's the one that really drives a lot of interesting conversations.
Mark?
I am in total agreement with that, and then I would add, probably at this point, you would want to encourage the customer to test the software, test the devices and the software in their environment, and also really drive home on this type of forum. I'd like to drive home that they really should be doing a lot of collaboration with their peers, and they can lean on Ian's team, they can lean on my team to put them in touch with their peers. We're all part of collaboration committees within the government and some in the commercial space within the industry verticals. And they can see anything from a lot of the organizations that we've deployed in the most secure environments, as you can imagine, are the same organizations that we're not allowed to talk about in public in a forum like this. But those groups are very happy to talk government to government with their counterparts, and quite frankly, even internationally with our allies. We'll put together government to government collaboration with them, and that really helps them to figure out a lot of the things that they otherwise would have to spend a lot of time on. If they're in a BYOD environment, how do people structure policy, how they address the legal aspects and those types of things. And they can see a breadth of differences that they may not have ever considered. For example, we've tested extensively with large organizations like Walmart and done penetration testing and scalability and multi-tenant architecture design. We've tested with big data centers about putting the technology in a private cloud environment and how that affects security and so on. So we'd really encourage the new customers, prospective customers, in a security posture to work with us to put them in touch with the folks that have spent 18 or 24 months putting their solution together.
We've all seen government agencies where there are so many different challenges out there, and so they just sort of freeze and wait until everything sort of ferrets its way out. Agencies don't have a choice with mobile. You're going mobile, and so these are all good checklist items to have on your list. I want to thank Google's Ian Kelly and Mark Williams from AirWatch. Great job, guys. A reminder, if we did not get to your question, I can't imagine, but if we didn't, Ian and Mark are going to be no, they're not going to be hanging out. They will be, they'll be chatting. This is a hangout. They'll be chatting in our virtual conference center. If there's something we didn't cover, you can ask them for yourself. And a reminder that all of this and all of our sessions will be available on demand on Google Federal's YouTube page. If you registered, we will send you the link to make sure that you get it. Just a reminder, hang out with us. Here's what we have coming up. We're going to talk later on this afternoon about working better together and collaboration, some good case studies there. But coming up next, we're going to talk about those needles in the haystacks. We're going to talk about speeding access to all that mission critical data that's there, but sometimes isn't always easy to find. We're going to talk about some tools that will help you find that. So that's all just ahead. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Mark. Nice hanging out with you. Thanks for being a part of Google's innovation for the nation.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Thank you, guys.